darkness, just darkness, and the sound of the jungle at night. Then, movement, shapes that don't belong to the tree line. They're low, deliberate, patient. You watch them settle into the shadows like they were born there, like the darkness isn't something they're hiding in but something they own. There's no sound, no clanking armor, no whispered commands. Just women, moving through the forest in perfect, absolute silence. And then it begins. The first blow is almost too fast to see. A Mahi sentry doesn't even turn around before he's down. And these women, these warriors, pour through the camp like water through a cracked dam, precise and inevitable and utterly without hesitation. They free the captives. They neutralize the threat. They leave a single carved totem behind in the dirt, a message for whoever comes looking. We were here, and we are not afraid of you finding out. In less than 3 minutes of screen time, before a single line of dialogue, before any title card or text on screen tells you where you are or who you're watching, you already know one thing for certain. You have never seen women like this in a Hollywood movie before. That is exactly the point. The film we're about to spend the next hour or so unpacking is The Woman King, released in September 2022, directed by Gina Prince Bythewood. And the opening raid I just described? That isn't borrowed drama. That is an invented spectacle for a Hollywood trailer. The women it depicts, the Agojie, were real. They were arguably the most feared female fighting force in recorded human history. And for nearly 200 years, their story has been sitting there waiting for someone with the vision and the courage to bring it to a mainstream global audience. The wait turned out to be worth it. Let's establish where we are, because the context makes everything that follows hit harder. It's 1823, West Africa. The Kingdom of Dahomey, a sophisticated, culturally rich, deeply organized society located in what is now the modern nation of Benin. Dahomey isn't a primitive backwater, and the Woman King is careful never to treat it like one. This is a kingdom with a palace, a court, a political structure, a military hierarchy, and a complex web of alliances and debts that would feel familiar to anyone who's ever watched a political drama. King Ghezo has recently taken power. He's smart, he's charming, and he's inherited a problem. Dahomey is under the thumb of the Oyo Empire, ... Dahomey pays them tribute. That tribute, increasingly, means capture people sold into the Atlantic slave trade, a brutal, dehumanizing economy that European traders have embedded into the region's politics so deeply that by 1823, it's hard to imagine the whole system unwinding without everything collapsing. Dahomey sits at one of the busiest slave trading ports on the West African coast, Ouida. The Portuguese are there, the money is there, and the moral weight of that is something the film refuses to look away from. Im. But here's what Dahomey also has that no other kingdom in the region has: the Agojie. The Agojie were an all-female military regiment that served the Kingdom of Dahomey for roughly 2 centuries, beginning in the 1600s and lasting until the French colonial conquest in the 1890s. At their height, they numbered somewhere between 600 and 6,000 soldiers, depending on the period and the king. They trained with a ferocity that bordered on mythological, sent into the wilderness with no food or weapons to survive alone, forced to storm walls of thorny acacia branches without flinching, required to demonstrate absolute control over physical pain and emotional weakness. In 1861, an Italian priest named Francesco Borrero watched 3,000 Agojie charge through a wall of thorny branches in a demonstration of readiness, no screaming, no visible pain, nothing but disciplined force. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. European visitors who encountered the Agojie couldn't reconcile what they were watching with their assumptions about women. So they called them Amazons, borrowing the label from Greek mythology. It was a name that stuck in Western historical records, even though the Agojie had their own name, their own traditions, and their own identity that had nothing to do with Greek mythology. That erasure, calling them by someone else's story instead of their own, says a lot about how history gets written and who gets to be the author. The Agojie made a vow of celibacy upon joining. They gave up the possibility of marriage, children, the domestic path that was the only option available to most women in 1823 West Africa. In exchange, they got something that almost no woman anywhere on the planet could access at that time: a profession, a rank, a weapon, and the authority to use it. They answered directly to the king. They were feared by enemy soldiers who had been culturally conditioned to believe that killing a woman was shameful, which meant, in a strange twist, that the Agojie's gender was itself a tactical advantage. Facing them wasn't just physically dangerous, it was psychologically destabilizing. And yet, before the Woman King, virtually no one in mainstream cinema had told their story. Why is that? Partly it's the geography. Hollywood has historically told stories about European or American military history, with everything else treated as background or footnote. Partly it's the demographics of who gets greenlit. A 50 million historical epic centered entirely on black women wasn't exactly a movie studios were lining up to make. Partly, honestly, it's the same reason so much important history stays buried. It was inconvenient to the story that powerful people wanted to tell about the world. Gina Prince Bythewood knows all of this. She's been navigating Hollywood's resistance to stories like this one for her entire career. Her previous work, Love and Basketball, The Secret Life of Bees, Beyond the Lights, established her as a filmmaker with a rare gift for emotional depth and character truth. But it was her 2020 Netflix action film, The Old Guard, starring Charlize Theron, that finally opened a specific door. It proved she could direct large-scale action sequences, manage ensemble casts in combat situations, and bring genuine cinematic scope to a genre that Hollywood hadn't been trusting her with. The original story concept was developed by actress Maria Bello, who became fascinated by the Agojie and spent years trying to get the project made before bringing in screenwriter Dana Stevens. The journey from concept to screen was roughly 7 years. 7 years of pitching, developing, convincing studios that yes, this story deserves the same budget and the same resources that a story about European soldiers or American heroes would receive. 7 years before Viola Davis was attached as both star and producer, before Sony's TriStar Pictures came on board, before a single frame was shot. Prince Bythewood didn't just accept the assignment when it arrived. She threw herself into the history with the obsession of someone who understood what was at stake. The entire production became an exercise in specificity. How do you recreate a West African kingdom from 1823 in a way that feels lived in and true? Production designer Akin Mackenzie led a team that researched the architecture, the textiles, the daily rhythms of life in Abomey, the Dahomeyan capital. Costume designer Gersha Phillips handmade many of the Agojie's garments after studying period-accurate fabrics and designs. Cinematographer Polly Morgan, who we'll get into in detail later because her work here is genuinely remarkable, spent months developing a visual language for the kingdom that was warm, saturated, and alive, in direct contrast to the cool desaturation that Hollywood often defaults to when telling African stories. And then there was the fighting. The Agojie's combat style had to be invented, essentially from scratch. Not Western martial arts, not Hollywood action movie choreography, but something that felt like it grew organically out of this specific culture, this specific training ground. Choreographer Ramona Ramirez worked with the cast for months before filming began, building a physical vocabulary that felt real and purposeful. The result is action that doesn't look like anything you've seen before, because it isn't anything you've seen before. Here's the central question that's going to drive everything we talk about in this essay. What does it mean, really mean, when a mainstream Hollywood action epic is built entirely around black women? Not as love interests, not as supporting players in someone else's journey, not as symbols of suffering or symbols of strength, but as fully dimensional human beings who are the generals, the politicians, the warriors, the mothers, the mentors, the moral decision makers in every single scene of a 2-hour film, because that's what The Woman King is, and it sounds simple when you say it, but it isn't. Hollywood has made hundreds of war epics. It has celebrated soldiers and generals and kingdoms from ancient Greece to medieval England to revolutionary America to World War II. It has told us over and over again what heroism looks like, who deserves an epic, whose story is worth the wide frame and the thundering score and the 135-minute runtime. And for almost the entire history of the medium, the answer to that question has looked remarkably similar. The Woman King changes the answer, not by making a statement, not by explaining itself or justifying its premise or asking for permission. It changes the answer by simply doing it, by dropping you into that pre-dawn forest raid and daring you to look away. The film's title comes from a specific Dahomeyan institution. The Woman King was the king's partner and equal in ruling the kingdom, a title of extraordinary power and responsibility. It's the position that, by the end of the film, General Nanisca will be offered. And the journey from soldier to that crown is the movie's emotional spine. But before we get to Nanisca's transformation, we need to understand the world she's protecting. And to understand that world, you have to understand something that the film holds in careful tension throughout its entire runtime. Dahomey was not a simple story. This is not a clean, heroic narrative about a perfect kingdom fighting against evil colonizers. The Kingdom of Dahomey in 1823 was actively participating in the Atlantic slave trade. Dahomeyan forces, including, at times, the Agojie, conducted raids on neighboring villages, captured people, and sold them to European traders at the port of Ouida. This is historically documented. It happened. And the film knows it happened, and it doesn't hide from that knowledge. What the Woman King does, and this is one of the things that makes it genuinely exceptional, is hold that moral complexity without collapsing it into either excuse or condemnation. Nanisca, within the film, is actively trying to get King Ghezo to stop the slave trade. She sees it as a slow destruction of their people, a corruption of everything the Agojie are supposed to protect. Ghezo resists. The economy of the kingdom depends on it, and so you have these women, these extraordinary, fierce, deeply human women, fighting to defend a kingdom that is simultaneously complicit in one of history's greatest crimes. That tension doesn't get resolved neatly. The film doesn't let itself off the hook, and neither should we as we watch it. What you're about to hear is a close, careful examination of a film that earns its scope. The Woman King is not a perfect movie. We'll note the places where it stumbles, where the Hollywood machinery sometimes overrides the historical reality, but it is, in many ways, a necessary movie. Necessary in the way that Black Panther was necessary in 2018, necessary in the way that Hidden Figures was necessary in 2016. Not because movies solve injustice, but because the stories we tell ourselves about who is heroic, who is epic, who is worth 2 hours of our best attention, those stories shape something fundamental about how we understand the world. The Agojie were real. Their courage was real. Their complexity was real. And for about 135 minutes, Gina Prince Bythewood and Viola Davis and an extraordinary ensemble of women are going to make sure you feel every bit of it. Let's start at the beginning. She arrives by force, not captured, not conquered, delivered by her own father. A young woman named Nawi, played with staggering presence by Thuso Mbedu, is dragged into the royal compound of King Ghezo because she has done something that, in the world of 1823 Dahomey, is apparently unforgivable. She refused to marry a man who beat her. She looked him dead in the face, decided he wasn't worth her time, and walked away. Her father, humiliated and furious, did what fathers in this world do when a daughter won't cooperate. He got rid of her. Watch Thuso Mbedu in this scene carefully, because the film could have played Nawi's arrival as tragedy, as a girl being discarded, as victimhood. It doesn't. From the moment she steps into that compound, Nawi looks around with her chin up and her eyes wide. Not with fear, but with something closer to hunger. She clocks the Agojie warriors in the courtyard. She watches them train. And the expression on her face isn't intimidated. It's interested. It's the look of someone who has just, entirely by accident, stumbled into the exact place they were always supposed to be. That single piece of performance from Mbedu tells you almost everything you need to know about who Nawi is. She didn't come here because she was looking for liberation. She didn't come here because she had a plan. She came here because she had nowhere else to go. And the film is deeply honest about that, because that's the truth of why many women find their power. Not through grand intention, but through a door that opens because every other door closed first. Now, before we follow Nawi any further, we need to understand the world she's just walked into. Because the kingdom of Dahomey in this film isn't a backdrop, it's a character. King Ghezo is introduced in a way that immediately complicates any easy reading of him. He isn't a tyrant, he isn't a savior. John Boyega plays him as a man who is genuinely, at times, admirable, generous, perceptive, politically shrewd, and deeply aware of the burden he carries. He's a young king trying to hold a kingdom together under enormous external pressure. The Oyo Empire demands tribute. European slave traders have their hooks in the economy of his port city. His own generals, including Nanisca, are pushing him in different directions about how Dahomey should survive the next decade. Boyega's physicality in this role is worth noting. He carries Ghezo with a kind of coiled authority that doesn't need to shout. There's a scene early in the film where he's receiving Nawi, deciding her fate in a matter of moments, and the camera catches something in his eyes that the rest of the scene doesn't explain yet. A calculation that isn't cruel, exactly, but is absolutely transactional. He sees people in terms of what they can offer the kingdom. That's not a flaw necessarily, that's what it costs to be a king. But it's a perspective that will put him in direct conflict with Nanisca in ways neither of them fully anticipates. And then there's Nanisca. If the film opens with the Agojie as a force, a collective, a unit, a phenomenon, then the early scenes of Act 1 are about slowly peeling back that collective until you find the individual at its center. General Nanisca is introduced after the opening raid, and Gina Prince Bythewood makes a deliberate, crucial choice here. She doesn't introduce Nanisca mid-battle. She doesn't lead with her physical power. She introduces her in a council meeting. Think about what that means. The first time you really meet Nanisca as a person, not as a silhouette in the forest, not as a body in motion. She's sitting across from King Ghezo, making a political argument. She's advocating. She's persuading. She's using words and strategy and moral authority to try to change the direction of a kingdom. The message is embedded right there in that choice of scene. This is a woman whose power isn't only physical. This is a leader. And those two things, warrior and leader, are not always the same, and the gap between them is one of the film's central tensions. The argument Nanisca is making is this: Dahomey needs to stop trading enslaved people and build an alternative economy based on crops, palm oil specifically. She lays out the case methodically, practically, almost without visible emotion. This is what survival looks like beyond the next 10 years. This is how you stop making your kingdom dependent on a system that is, increasingly, drawing the attention and the wrath of the world. Ghezo listens. He doesn't dismiss her. He genuinely weighs what she's saying. And then he essentially says, not yet. The economy isn't ready. The kingdom isn't ready. We need this income to survive, the Oyo tribute demands. It's a pragmatic answer. It's also, as Nanisca's expression makes absolutely clear, morally insufficient. And what's extraordinary about that scene is that neither of them is entirely wrong. That's the specific kind of moral complexity that most Hollywood films flinch from. The kind where two intelligent, principled people look at the same problem and come to irreconcilably different conclusions based on what they're each willing to sacrifice. Nanisca walks out of that meeting carrying the weight of it. She's used to carrying weight. But this particular weight, the knowledge that her kingdom is complicit in something she believes is destroying their people, is a different kind of burden than the ones you carry into battle. Because you can fight an enemy with a machete. You can't cut the moral compromise out of a kingdom. Meanwhile, Nawi is navigating her first days in the compound, and the film takes its time with this. Her initiation into the Agojie's world isn't a montage of highlights. It's awkward, it's physical, it's full of small humiliations and small victories, and the very specific social dynamics of women who have chosen each other as family. The warrior who takes her under her wing first is Izogie, played by Lashana Lynch, with a warmth and a wit that makes her the film's most immediately lovable presence. Izogie has the gift of being simultaneously the funniest person in the room and the most dangerous. She teases Nawi with a cheerfulness that isn't careless. It's a deliberate act of generosity, giving this newcomer something to push back against, a relationship that feels real rather than formal. "You're not the first girl dragged here against her will," Izogie tells her, in so many words, "and you probably won't be the last. So you might as well get good at it." That's the philosophy of the Agojie in miniature. Whatever brought you here, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you do now. But Nawi isn't good at taking that advice quietly. She's impulsive, not recklessly, but with a particular quality of impatience that comes from a lifetime of being told to sit down and be still, and she has never once found that instruction convincing. She pushes back against the training structure. She mouths off. She gets herself into trouble in ways that would be funny if the stakes weren't so high. And you never once lose sympathy for her, because Mbedu plays all of it with such complete internal logic. Nawi isn't being difficult for the sake of it. She's being difficult because she's never been in an environment that could actually match her energy, and she doesn't quite know how to calibrate herself to something real yet. The first time Nanisca really sees Nawi, not just registers her as a new recruit, but actually sees her, is the scar. It happens quietly. Nawi's shoulder is exposed during a training assessment, and there's a mark there, a small, distinctive scar. Not a wound from battle, something older than that, something that was put there deliberately a long time ago. Nanisca's reaction is a masterclass in what Viola Davis does better than almost anyone working in film right now. Her face does almost nothing. That is not an accident. It's a choice, and it's the right one. Because Nanisca's face doing nothing in that moment, when you understand later what she recognized, is the most devastating possible response. She doesn't gasp, she doesn't freeze visibly. She becomes, very precisely, more controlled than she was a second before. The kind of control that only comes when something has hit you so hard, you need every muscle in your body to hold yourself together. The film doesn't explain this yet. It lets it sit. And the willingness to let that moment be unexplained, to trust the audience to hold that unanswered question and carry it forward, is one of the most confident narrative decisions Prince Bythewood makes in the entire film. We'll come back to that scar. We'll come back to it in a way that makes the whole story crack open. But for now, all we know is that Nanisca saw something she wasn't prepared to see, and that the world of Act 1, which has the surface appearance of order, hierarchy, and controlled purpose, is secretly full of unresolved things. Unresolved grief, unresolved guilt, unresolved history. The political layer of Act 1 thickens when we meet the Oyo general, Oba Ade, played by Jimmy Odukoya, with a cold precision that doesn't tip into caricature. He's not the movie's mustache-twirling villain. He's a man exercising the power his position gives him, demanding tribute, demonstrating dominance, making sure Dahomey understands the hierarchy. But there's something in the way he looks at Nanisca specifically that suggests the history between them runs deeper than a political relationship. He has a particular quality of attention around her, focused, personal, dangerous, and Nanisca has a particular quality of stillness around him that's different from her normal command stillness. This is another thread the film plants without explaining in Act 1, another piece of the architecture that only becomes visible when you understand what's underneath it. What Prince Bythewood is doing across this entire first act, if you step back and watch the structure, is building a world that has layers, where the political surface of Dahomey's struggle for survival is underlaid by personal histories that nobody is talking about openly. The kingdom is in crisis. The Agojie are training. A new recruit is finding her feet. A general is fighting to change her king's mind. And somewhere underneath all of that, there are secrets, there are wounds, there are relationships between people that the official language of the court and the compound can't contain. Act 1 ends, or rather, transitions, not with an explosion or a declaration, but with a feeling. The feeling of a world in motion, moving towards something none of its inhabitants can fully see yet. Nawi has found a home she didn't know she was looking for. Nanisca has seen a scar she wasn't ready to see. Ghezo has made a compromise he can't entirely defend, and the Oyo Empire, somewhere out beyond the tree line, is preparing to make sure Dahomey keeps paying what it owes. What the film establishes in Act 1 is the architecture of collision, not between good people and bad people. That would be too easy, and Prince Bythewood is too good a filmmaker for easy. The collision is between people who all have legitimate claims on what they want, and a world that isn't large enough to give all of them what they need simultaneously. Nanisca wants to protect her people and clean her kingdom's conscience. Ghezo wants to keep his kingdom alive. Nawi wants to be seen for what she actually is. The Agojie want to be the force that makes all of those things possible. And somewhere in the gap between what everyone wants and what the world will allow, that's where the story lives. That's where every great story lives. Training doesn't begin with weapons. It begins with walls. Specifically, a wall of thorned acacia branches, thick, interlocking, vicious, that the Agojie recruits are ordered to charge through without breaking stride, without slowing down, without making a sound. First time through, Nawi hesitates, just for a fraction of a second. Just long enough for the thorns to tear into her skin and the pain to register on her face. The veterans don't hesitate. They've done this so many times that the pain is no longer an interruption. It's just part of the movement. It's been absorbed. That image is the Woman King's thesis about what it takes to become who you need to be, delivered without a word of dialogue. The training sequences in this film are one of its quiet masterworks, and they're worth slowing down to appreciate because they're doing something more layered than what they look like on the surface. On the surface, they're exciting, physically demanding, kinetic, shot by Polly Morgan with a handheld immediacy that puts you in the dirt and the sweat alongside these women. But underneath the surface, each training sequence is a scene about psychology, not physicality. Every obstacle the recruits face is really a question. What are you willing to give up to become this? The thorns ask it. The sparring rings ask it. The endurance runs through punishing terrain ask it. And each recruit, but especially Nawi, answers the question differently each time, and the answers change. What Prince Bythewood understands, and what lesser war films consistently miss, is that the making of a soldier is also the unmaking of a civilian. You cannot train yourself into a warrior without training yourself out of something else. There's a version of Nawi who would have found a way to endure that marriage her father arranged, who would have learned, through sheer exhausted pragmatism, how to shrink herself into whatever shape the world demanded. The training doesn't just build her body, it systematically dismantles every reflex she developed to survive in a world that didn't want her to take up space. And watching that happen, watching someone become more themselves through a process that is objectively brutal, is one of the most quietly radical things this film does. But the training ground isn't only a place of severity. This is where the film reveals something about the Agojie that European historical records almost always missed, because European observers were too busy being astonished by their combat capability to notice the other thing happening in plain sight. These women liked each other. The scene where Izogie braids Nawi's hair is one of the most important scenes in the entire film, and it doesn't involve a single sword. They're sitting together after training, both of them exhausted, both of them a little beat up, and Izogie just starts doing Nawi's hair, with the ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times for 100 different women in this compound. And they talk, not about war, not about strategy, not about Oyo politics. They talk the way two women talk when they trust each other enough to drop the armor for a few minutes. Izogie talks about men, specifically about a man she clearly still thinks about, and about the cost of choosing this life over that one. She isn't bitter about it. She isn't performing sacrifice. She's just honest. There are things she gave up, and she knows she gave them up, and some mornings that's heavier than others. Lashana Lynch plays this scene with such precise, unguarded humanity that it catches you off guard after everything that came before it. We've seen Izogie in combat. We've seen her as mentor, as authority, as the veteran who can run the thorn gauntlet without flinching. Here, she's a woman who braids hair and misses someone and makes a younger woman laugh. Both things are completely true simultaneously. And the scene's great achievement is that it makes the Agojie's choice feel real in a way that the training sequences, for all their power, cannot quite access. Because real choices live in quiet moments like this one, not in dramatic declarations. For Nawi, this is something new. The intimacy of it. The fact that someone is taking care of her, not formally, not as duty, but just because they want to, because that's what the women in this compound do for each other when the day is done. She grew up in a household where her value was measured by her marriageability. Here, her value is measured by what she's willing to become. That's a different kind of pressure, but it's also, for the first time in her life, a kind of freedom. And then there's Nanisca at night, and the world the film shows us when she closes her eyes. The PTSD sequences in The Woman King are filmed with a restraint that feels, in the context of contemporary cinema, almost radical. We live in an era of trauma portrayed through sensory overload, sudden cuts, distorted sound design, visual chaos meant to simulate the experience of intrusion. Prince Bythewood does almost none of that. Nanisca's flashbacks are quiet. They surface in fragments, a face, a physical sensation, the specific helplessness of being held down by someone stronger. And the camera watches Viola Davis's body in those moments more than it watches the fragments themselves. Because the film understands something crucial, the trauma isn't in the memory. The trauma is in what the body does when the memory arrives. Watch the way Davis holds her own hands during these moments. The way her breathing changes, not dramatically, not performatively, but with the micro-precision of an actor who has thought deeply about what this does to a nervous system. The muscle control in her jaw, the quality of stillness she achieves that isn't calm, it's suppression. The difference between those two things is everything, and Davis never lets you confuse them. What happened to Nanisca is something the film reveals in stages, and we should respect that architecture here. But what we can say in the context of Act 2 is this: Nanisca carries a history of violence that was done to her by someone who is still in the world, still holding power, still capable of doing it again. That isn't an abstraction for her. It's operational intelligence. Every decision she makes as a general, the level of preparation she demands, the ferocity she requires from her warriors, the absolute refusal to let any of the women under her command be taken, is informed by what she survived and what she will not allow to happen again. Her trauma didn't make her a warrior, but it shaped the kind of warrior she became. It gave her a specific anger that most warriors don't have, not the hot, adrenaline anger of battle, but the cold, long-burning anger of someone who knows exactly what the enemy is capable of and has spent years ensuring she is more capable than that. The scene that cracks Act 2 open, the one that reorders everything, arrives without announcement. Nawi has pushed back against authority one time too many. Nanisca confronts her directly, and what begins as a dressing down about discipline becomes something else entirely. The exact words matter less than what's underneath them. Nanisca is trying to explain why vulnerability is not a luxury the Agojie can afford, and in explaining it, she goes somewhere she clearly did not plan to go. She tells Nawi that she was raped. Not in those exact clinical words. The film speaks around the thing with the vocabulary of a woman describing it to another woman, which has its own kind of precision. She was captured. She was violated. She became pregnant. And when the child was born, Nanisca couldn't keep her. Not in the Agojie. Not under those circumstances. Not with who the father was and what that would mean for the child's safety and her own ability to function. So she gave her up. And to make sure she could find her again, someday, if she survived long enough for someday to arrive, she put a mark on the child. Something small and distinctive, a cut that would scar, a shark tooth pressed into soft skin, so that she would know her, wherever she ended up. Whatever she became. The silence that follows this confession is the loudest moment in the film. Davis delivers it without breaking. That is the only way to say it. She doesn't break, doesn't cry, doesn't reach for the catharsis that a lesser film would have handed her. She says the most devastating thing, and then she holds herself together, because that is what Nanisca has always done, because that is the only way she survived, because the alternative to holding yourself together is falling apart, and she has never once been in a position where falling apart was an option she could afford. And if you are paying attention, if you have been holding that unanswered scar from Act 1 in the back of your mind, exactly where the film placed it, then what you feel in this moment isn't just sadness, it's the structural pleasure of something clicking into place, and the instantaneous devastation of understanding exactly what it clicked into. You know where Nanisca's daughter is. You know she doesn't know, she knows. You know the entire movie has been building toward an acknowledgement that nobody in it has the language for yet. That's great filmmaking. That's the difference between a story that tells you what to feel and a story that builds the architecture so carefully that the feeling is inevitable. Act Two's final pressure comes from outside the compound walls. Nawi, proving that she is not yet the soldier she needs to be, at least not in terms of discipline, goes on an unauthorized reconnaissance mission with a few other recruits. The intention is legitimate. Gather intelligence on Oyo movements, understand what the kingdom is actually facing. The execution is reckless, and it nearly costs her everything. She and her companions are captured, held, briefly subsumed into exactly the machine, the slave trade, the holding camps, the chains that Nanisca has been trying to dismantle. What this sequence does, that's particularly smart, is put Nawi inside the horror directly. Not as a witness to someone else's captivity, but as someone who experiences, even briefly, what it feels like to have your freedom erased by economics. Up until this point, the slave trade has been a political argument, something Nanisca and Ghezo debate in a council room, something that lives in the abstract space of policy and revenue and kingdom survival. Now it's a chain around Nawi's wrist. Now it's a face in a holding pen. Now it's not abstract at all. Her rescue comes with consequences. It accelerates the conflict with the Oyo in ways that Ghezo was trying to avoid, and it forces Nanisca into a direct confrontation with the thing she has been angling toward all along, a full military response against the Oyo that Ghezo hasn't authorized, using a force that her king hasn't fully deployed. It's insubordination dressed as strategy, and Nanisca knows it. She does it anyway. Because she has already made the calculation, not just the military calculation, how many warriors, what approach, what objective. The deeper calculation, what is she willing to risk to protect the women under her command? What is she willing to sacrifice of her position, her relationship with Ghezo, her own safety? The answer, it turns out, is everything. There's a quality to Act Two in The Woman King that I want to name before we move forward because it's one of the things that distinguishes this film from the large majority of action epics with similar ambition. Act Two doesn't use its training sequences and its intimate scenes and its political escalations as separate components. It weaves them together so tightly that the emotional and the tactical become genuinely inseparable. When Nawi runs the thorned gauntlet the second time and doesn't hesitate, that moment lands differently because we just watched her braid hair and talk about giving things up with Izogie. When Nanisca's PTSD surfaces in the middle of a tactical meeting, it lands differently because we've seen how hard she works to keep those two realities, the general and the survivor, from touching each other. The film's great structural achievement is refusing to treat its character moments and its plot mechanics as different categories. Everything that happens in Act Two is simultaneously a plot development and a character revelation. Nothing is filler. Nothing is a pause before the next action beat. The quiet scenes and the violent scenes are, in this film, doing the exact same work. That is very hard to do. Most films that try it don't quite manage it. The Woman King manages it because Prince Bythewood and her cast have done the work of making these characters so specifically, irreducibly human that every scene they're in, regardless of what's happening in it, is a scene about who they are. By the time Act Two ends, everything is accelerating. The war with the Oyo is no longer theoretical. Nanisca's past is no longer buried. It's pressing against the surface from inside. Nawi has tasted what the enemy is capable of, and it has not frightened her into compliance. It has lit something in her that is going to be extremely difficult to contain. The storm is here. The thing about the final act of The Woman King is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no single moment where a horn sounds and the film shifts gears from drama into spectacle. The war arrives, the way wars usually arrive in real life. Not as a clean break from everything that came before, but as the inevitable consequence of every decision, every compromise, every unresolved tension that has been quietly accumulating since the first frame. By the time the Agojie are moving toward the Oyo stronghold, the stakes aren't abstract. They're personal. You know exactly who these women are. You know what they've given up. You know what they're carrying into the fight that has nothing to do with strategy or kingdom politics. That knowledge is what makes everything that follows hit the way it does. Gina Prince. Bythewood stages the assault on the Oyo camp with a clarity of geography that is genuinely rare in contemporary action filmmaking. One of the persistent failures of modern battle sequences is spatial incoherence. The camera gets so close, the editing gets so fast, that you lose track of where bodies are in relation to each other and what any given moment actually costs. Prince Bythewood does the opposite. She gives you a clear picture of the terrain, the positions, the objectives. You know who is where, and you know what it means if they don't make it out. The Agojie moved through the Oyo camp in formation first, a disciplined military unit executing a plan that Nanisca has built with precise, experienced intelligence. Watch how the choreography reflects the training we saw in Act 2. The movements aren't improvised. They're not the Baroque, acrobatic flourishes of Hollywood's typical martial arts vocabulary. They're economical, purposeful, effective, the fighting style of women who have trained not to look impressive but to win. Every strike is designed to neutralize a threat as quickly as possible. Every positioning choice reflects an awareness of the women on either side. Its combat is teamwork, which is both more realistic and more emotionally resonant than combat as individual heroics. But formations break under pressure. Plans meet reality and bend. And what Prince Bythewood is building toward, what the choreography slowly, deliberately fragments into, is a series of individual confrontations, each of which carries a weight of personal history that the tactical overview couldn't contain. Nanisca's single combat with Oba Ade, the Oyo general, is the scene you've been waiting for since Act 1 established the charged, specific quality of his attention toward her. When it arrives, it's not cathartic in any simple way. It's not the clean victory of justified vengeance. It's brutal and ugly and deeply physical in a way that isn't exciting so much as it is necessary, because the film has been honest from the beginning about what Oba represents to Nanisca, and honest endings to violent histories don't arrive wrapped in triumph. What Viola Davis does in this sequence is something that goes beyond athleticism, though the athleticism is undeniably real. The entire cast trained for months, and it shows in ways that CGI cannot replicate. What she brings that no amount of physical preparation can manufacture is the specific emotional temperature of a woman fighting someone who hurt her at the deepest possible level. This isn't the controlled, purposeful efficiency of the Agojie in formation. This is something raw, something that has been waiting inside Nanisca for years and is now, finally, allowed to exist outside of her. She wins. But the film doesn't linger on that victory. It moves forward because Nanisca moves forward. Because she has always understood that winning one battle, even this particular battle, even this one, doesn't resolve what it was fought over. The wound doesn't close just because the man who made it can't make it again. That's not how trauma works. That's not how history works. And the Woman King is too honest a film to pretend otherwise. And then Izogie dies. I want to take a moment before describing this scene to acknowledge what it means that it works as devastatingly as it does. The death of a beloved supporting character is one of the most reliable emotional tools in dramatic storytelling, and also one of the most frequently abused. It can be cheap. It can be a shortcut to feeling that a film hasn't actually earned through the slower, harder work of making you love someone. We've all watched a character die in a movie and felt nothing, because the film gave us reasons to be impressed by them without giving us reasons to miss them. Lashana Lynch's Izogie is the reason this scene doesn't work that way, because across the entire film, the training ground, the braiding scene, the teasing of Nawi, the quiet moments where her warmth broke through the severity of Agojie life, Lynch has built a person, not a symbol of warmth or a narrative function labeled mentor. A specific, irreplaceable human being who had a sense of humor and a missing man and a gift for making the women around her feel like they were going to be okay. She is captured by Oyo forces during the battle before the Agojie can reach her. What happens next is swift and deliberately, painfully underlit. The film doesn't sensationalize it. It doesn't slow down for it or score it with swelling strings or frame it for maximum dramatic impact. It just happens, the way real loss happens. Without warning, without ceremony, without the decency of preparation. Nawi sees it. She doesn't scream. She doesn't collapse. Thuso Mbedu plays this moment with something that is harder to perform than grief. She plays shock, refusing to become grief, because the battlefield doesn't give her space for grief yet, and Nawi has learned enough, by now, to understand that surviving this moment requires postponing the weight of it. But you see the weight arrive in her eyes. You see it land and stay. And you understand, watching her, that the woman who comes out the other side of this battle will be carrying Izogie in a way she'll carry her for the rest of her life. The Agojie don't stop fighting when Izogie dies. They can't. But the film has done something very specific by placing her death in the middle of the battle sequence rather than at its end. It refuses to let the military victory feel uncomplicated. Every moment of success that follows is shadowed by what was lost to achieve it. The Oyo camp falls. The captives are freed. The objective is accomplished. And none of that is enough to make what it costs feel acceptable. That is the honest arithmetic of war, and most films don't have the courage to do it. Meanwhile, Nawi's situation during the battle has its own complications, and they come in the form of Malik, the young man of mixed Portuguese and African heritage she's developed feelings for across the film's second act. In the chaos of the assault, Nawi is in danger of being swept into the slave trade's machinery again. Malik intervenes. He uses money from within the very trading economy that Nanisca has been arguing against, money that is stained with the history of what that trade does to people, to buy Nawi's safety, to buy her time. It's an act of love. It is also, unmistakably, an act that is complicit in the system it's trying to circumvent. And the film doesn't smooth that contradiction over. It lets it sit there, unresolved, because that's the truth of what it meant to survive in 1823. Sometimes the only tools available to you are the tools of the system you're trying to escape. Malik doesn't get a heroic moment here. He gets a human one. He does what he can with what he has, in a situation where nothing available to him is clean. This detail is quietly one of the film's most politically sophisticated choices, because it extends the moral complexity beyond Dahomey's official position and into the intimate, personal scale, into the choices that individual human beings make when they're trying to protect the people they love inside systems that are larger than any of them. The slave trade isn't just a political argument in a council room. It's the currency that buys a young woman a few more hours of freedom. That's the specific, uncomfortable way that large historical crimes live inside individual lives. Nanisca's most significant act of the entire film doesn't happen during the fight with Agojie. It happens in the decision she makes after the battle, when she defies Ghezo's direct order to stand down and instead leads the Agojie to free the captives held in the Oyo's possession. This is insubordination, clear, deliberate, consequential insubordination. And she does it without hesitation, because she has already made a decision, at some point during the arc of this story, without any declaration or ceremony, that the women in those chains matter more than her position, her standing, her relationship with the king. This is the moment that earns the coronation that follows, not the combat, not the victory. This, the willingness to risk everything for people, the official mission didn't include. That's what the title Woman King actually means in this film, not just a rank, but a specific quality of leadership, the kind that chooses people over politics, the kind that Ghezo, for all his genuine qualities, hasn't been able to choose consistently. The moment between Nanisca and Nawi that closes the film's story is not a tearful reunion. Let me be very clear about that, because the restraint of it is the whole point. There is no embrace, no confession, no dramatic scene where mother and daughter finally say the words that the audience has been aching to hear since the shark tooth moment in Act 2. What happens is quieter and more devastating than any of that. A look, a specific, private acknowledgement between two people who both understand what they are to each other and who both understand, perhaps more clearly, because of who they've each become, that the relationship between them can't be retroactively fixed by naming it. The naming matters, but the naming alone isn't healing. Healing is what they do with the time that comes after. What the film offers, instead of resolution, is the beginning of possibility. The first breath of a relationship that will have to be built from the ground up between two adults on terms that neither of them has negotiated before. It's honest. It's quietly radical in a cultural landscape where stories about mothers and children almost always demand the cathartic reconciliation scene. The Woman King withholds that catharsis, not to punish us, but because it respects these two women enough to acknowledge that what they're facing is harder and longer and more important than a single scene could contain. The coronation sequence is, in structural terms, the film's final image of what it has been arguing for all along. Ghezo offers Nanisca the title of Woman King, his partner and equal in ruling the kingdom, a recognition of what she has demonstrated across the entire film, that the survival of Dahomey depends not just on military power, but on moral clarity, and that she has more of the latter than anyone else in his court. She accepts, not with triumph, with the weight of someone who has just been given the heaviest possible version of what they asked for. The camera finds Nawi in the crowd as Nanisca is installed, Nawi watching her mother, though she can't use that word yet, not in public, not in the architecture of what they are to each other, receive the highest possible honor. And in Mbedu's face, in that moment, you see something that is not quite pride, and not quite grief, and not quite joy. It's all of those things at once, in the specific proportion that comes from watching someone you love receive recognition that costs them more than the recognition can repay. The film ends, not with answers, but with an image. Nanisca standing in her new authority, carrying everything she has always carried. In a world that has shifted just enough to give that weight somewhere to go, it is, in every sense, an earned ending, not a happy ending. The Oyo haven't been permanently defeated. The slave trade hasn't been abolished. The kingdom's moral reckoning is still ongoing. But a true ending. One that honors the complexity of everything that came before it, rather than resolving that complexity into something smaller and easier to hold. These women fought. They lost something irreplaceable. They changed something permanent, and they are still standing. That's the story. Now let's talk about the people who told it. A script is a blueprint. A great script is a great blueprint, but blueprints don't move you, buildings do. And what transforms the architecture of the Woman King screenplay into something that lingers in your chest long after the credits roll is the specific, irreplaceable work of 5 performers who understood, with complete clarity, what they were being asked to bring to this story and rose to meet it in ways that go far beyond the requirements of the job. Let's start at the top. There is a particular kind of performance that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't reach for you. It doesn't signal its own brilliance with visible technique or demonstrative emotionality. It simply exists on screen with a completeness so total that you stop thinking about the actor and start thinking about the person. And then, later, when you think back on the film, you realize you can't separate the two anymore. Viola Davis's performance as General Nanisca is that kind of performance. It is one of the most physically and psychologically committed pieces of acting in her extraordinary career, and it is, almost paradoxically, one of the most internal. Let's start with the body, because that's where Davis starts. Nanisca is a woman who has spent decades learning to make her body into armor. Not just in the sense of physical conditioning, though the conditioning is real, and Davis clearly trained with an intensity that shows in every movement, but in a more fundamental psychological sense. Nanisca moves through the world with the contained purposefulness of someone who decided, at some point in her past, that her body was a tool and a weapon and nothing else. Softness is not an option she's left herself. Vulnerability is not a door she's left unlocked. You see it in her posture, never relaxed, even in private moments. You see it in how she occupies space, precisely, efficiently, without the expansiveness of someone who feels safe enough to take up more room than she needs. This is a specific physical choice, and it's entirely Davis's. The script tells you who Nanisca is. Davis shows you how being that person feels from the inside. The council scene early in Act 1, where Nanisca makes the case to Ghezo about ending the slave trade, is a masterclass in this containment. She sits across from her king in a room full of men who have opinions about what she's saying, and she argues her position with a precision that is almost eerily calm. No raised voice, no visible frustration when Ghezo pushes back. Just the relentless, patient application of logic and moral argument delivered by someone who has made peace with the possibility that she won't be heard and is making the argument anyway. That specific combination, fierce conviction delivered without heat, is extremely difficult to play without tipping into either coldness or self-righteousness. Davis finds the exact center of it. You feel how much she cares. You also feel how much she has disciplined that caring into something that can function in a room like this one. Now watch the same woman in the scene where she assesses new recruits. Same composure, different temperature underneath it. When Nanisca is in the training ground, there's something that functions almost like pleasure in her efficiency. The satisfaction of a craftsperson working in their medium, surveying raw material and knowing exactly what it will take to shape it. She's exacting, and she's hard, and she isn't particularly warm, and none of that is cruelty. It's the honesty of someone who knows that unprepared soldiers die and who takes preventing that personally. And then there's the moment with the scar. We discussed this in the story segments, but we need to return to it now through the lens of performance rather than narrative, because what Davis does in that 10-second window is the technical and emotional center of her entire characterization. Nawi's shoulder is exposed. The mark is visible, and Davis's face, pay close attention here, does almost nothing. Not nothing in the sense of blankness or disengagement, but nothing in the sense of iron control. You can see the control. That's the paradox. The effort of keeping her face still becomes, in Davis's hands, more expressive than any reaction could be, because the effort itself is the information. You understand from the effort alone that what she's seeing has hit her somewhere that has not been accessible in years. This is acting at its finest, not acting as the performance of emotion, but acting as the precise physical communication of the suppression of emotion. There's a whole school of screen performance that understands this principle, and very few practitioners who can execute it at Davis's level. She makes you feel the depth of the lake by showing you how hard she's working to keep the surface still. The PTSD sequences demand something different, a different quality of exposure, and Davis navigates the shift without a single false step. These scenes require her to show us what Nanisca looks like when the armor fails, not because she chose to remove it, but because something reached through it in the dark. And what's remarkable about how Davis plays these moments is that even here, even in the intrusion of traumatic memory, even in the involuntary surrender of control, there's still Nanisca trying to hold herself together. The suppression doesn't go away, it just loses temporarily. You see the internal struggle between the reflex to contain and the thing that can no longer be contained, and it plays out in Davis's hands, her shoulders, the way her breathing becomes deliberate and then ragged, and then deliberate again as she pulls herself back. This is important because it would be easy to play Nanisca's trauma moments as a revelation of the real Nanisca underneath the armor, a softer, more vulnerable self that has been hidden. Davis refuses that interpretation entirely. The woman in those flashback moments isn't more real than the general in the council room. She's the same person in a different kind of crisis. The armor isn't a mask hiding a true face. The armor is part of the face. Both things are Nanisca, simultaneously, always. That refusal to split her character into the warrior and the wounded woman is the philosophical core of the performance, and it's what makes Nanisca one of the most fully realized female protagonists in recent Hollywood cinema. The scene where Nanisca tells Nawi about the child, about the rape, the pregnancy, the shark tooth, the giving up, is the performance's emotional climax, and Davis takes it to precisely the right place, which is not the place you expect. There is no collapse, no release. What happens instead is a very specific kind of opening, a door that has been sealed for years, opened just far enough to let one person through, and then the deliberate, necessary act of holding it open even though every instinct in Nanisca's body is telling her to close it again. Davis plays the confession with the quality of someone speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. The words come up slowly, with effort, but they come, and when they arrive without the ornamental emotion of self-pity or the distancing mechanism of clinical flatness. They arrive as truth, just truth, spoken to another person for what may be the first time. What Davis does physically in the aftermath of the confession, the way she sits with the silence, the way her hands settle, the micro-adjustments in her posture as she processes the fact that she has now said the thing out loud and the world hasn't ended. That physical aftermath is, if anything, more powerful than the words themselves, because it shows you that surviving the confession is its own act of courage, and that Nanisca, who has survived so much that required so much courage, finds this particular thing as hard as anything she has ever done. The final dimension of Davis's performance that deserves extended analysis is the coronation, and specifically the quality of acceptance she brings to it. This is not the triumphant climax of someone who has won. It's the moment of reckoning for someone who has been offered the thing they fought for and is now staring at the full weight of what it means to receive it. Davis plays the coronation with stillness and something that is almost grief, the grief of becoming something irrevocable, of stepping into a definition of yourself that will now be permanent. She doesn't smile broadly, she doesn't weep. She receives the honor, the way a soldier receives a commission in the field, with the sobriety of someone who understands exactly what they're accepting responsibility for. And in the final beat of the scene, when the camera finds her eyes and holds there, you see something that might be peace. Not happiness, not relief, but the deep, hard-won stillness of someone who has, at last, found a shape for the weight they've always been carrying. Viola Davis has spent her career making studios believe that a black woman can carry a prestige film on the sheer force of her talent. The Woman King is the first time she was given the full resources of a Hollywood epic to prove it on this scale. She does not waste a single frame. Thuso Mbedu had one of the hardest jobs in The Woman King, and it's easy to overlook that difficulty because she makes it look effortless. The job was this: carry the audience through a film. That is, on paper, Viola Davis's showcase, while simultaneously making Nawi's arc feel equal in weight and personal in a completely different way, and do it without ever competing for dominance in scenes where competing would be the natural instinct. That requires a specific kind of generosity and a specific kind of confidence. You have to trust that not being the loudest person in the room doesn't mean you're not being heard. Mbedu, who came to this film from her extraordinary work in the South African TV drama Izogie and the Amazon series, The Underground Railroad, understands this principle at a cellular level. She is an actor who works from the inside out, which means that even when Nawi is being impulsive, even when she's making the reckless choices that make you want to shake her, you feel the internal logic of those choices. You're never ahead of her. You're with her. Nawi's opening, being delivered to the compound by her father, scanning the Agojie with that expression of barely contained interest, was discussed in the story segment. But let's dig into the specific technical choice Mbedu makes there. She plays Nawi as someone who is not performing strength. She is not squaring her jaw and refusing to show fear as a statement of defiance. The near absence of fear in her is genuine. She genuinely hasn't registered this situation as something to be afraid of yet, because her brain has already moved on to what it might mean and what might be possible here. That's a very specific kind of intelligence, restless, forward-leaning, unconventional, and Mbedu establishes it in the opening scene and never loses it. The training sequences are where Mbedu's physical work becomes impossible to ignore. She trained for months, and it shows, but more important than the physicality is what she does with her face and her body in the failures. When Nawi hesitates at the acacia wall the first time, the wince that crosses her face isn't simple pain. It's complicated, there's frustration in it, and the very beginning of determination, and the very faint shadow of self-recrimination. That's a lot of information to put into a half-second reaction shot. Mbedu puts it there with total economy. The relationship with Izogie is where Mbedu's warmth becomes fully visible, and it's worth spending time on the specific dynamic they establish together. Nawi and Izogie's connection works because Mbedu plays Nawi's response to Izogie's warmth. Not with immediate openness, but with a kind of careful, testing reception. The response of someone who has learned not to trust generosity until it proves itself. She accepts Izogie's mentorship with just enough resistance to make the full acceptance, when it comes, feel real. By the time of the braiding scene, that acceptance is complete, and Mbedu plays Nawi's end of the conversation with a quality of ease that feels genuinely earned. A young woman who has, for the first time in her life, found someone whose care she doesn't have to be suspicious of. The scene where Nawi learns of Izogie's death is the performance's most technically demanding moment, and Mbedu does something in it that very few actors would choose. She doesn't give us the grief immediately. She gives us the delay of the grief, the moment where the information arrives but the full weight of it hasn't caught up yet, where the body knows before the self does, and there's this strange, terrible gap between knowing and feeling. Her eyes change. Something behind them closes, but her face holds, because the battlefield doesn't give her a choice. And Nawi, who has been, across this entire film, in the process of learning what the Agojie are actually made of, has learned, finally, that being made of this means you carry your losses without stopping. What she does with that loss later, how it deepens her commitment, how it transforms the recklessness of her earlier decisions into something more purposeful and more costly, is mostly implied rather than stated. And that implication lives in Mbedu's physicality in the film's final sequences. She moves differently, not harder or faster, differently, with the specific gravity of someone who is now, permanently, carrying more than she was before. Mbedu's greatest scene, and possibly the most underappreciated performance moment in the entire film, is her response to the coronation. She's in the crowd. She is not the story of the coronation scene. Viola Davis is the story. But Mbedu, standing at the edge of the frame, watching her mother receive the highest possible honor in a kingdom that is also the kingdom of the woman who bore her and could not keep her. Mbedu communicates an entire internal universe in the texture of her stillness. There are things that Nawi wants to feel and can't let herself feel yet. There are things she is feeling that she doesn't have words for, and all of it lives in Mbedu's face, quietly, without asking for your attention, which means that when you do look at her in that frame, the impact is enormous. That is a star-making performance, full stop. Every ensemble has a character whose function is to make the world of the film feel habitable. Not livable in the sense of comfortable. The Woman King's world is never comfortable, but habitable in the sense of human, a place where people laugh and tease and look out for each other in small ways, not because the situation is easy, but because the people in it have chosen each other. Izogie is that character, and Lashana Lynch plays her with such abundant, specific humanity that the film feels dimmer every time she's not in a scene. What Lynch does that is genuinely technically remarkable is maintain Izogie's lightness without sacrificing her credibility as a warrior. These are not two separate modes that she switches between. They exist simultaneously, which is a much harder thing to achieve and a much truer representation of how actual soldiers function. The humor isn't a mask over the danger. The humor and the danger coexist, because coexistence is how people survive situations that would otherwise consume them. Watch Lynch in the training sequences alongside Mbedu. She's demanding of Nawi, genuinely demanding, without apology, but the demand comes packaged in a tone that communicates something underneath it. I'm pushing you because I believe you can take this, and believing you can take it is a form of respect. That nuance, the care inside the rigor, is entirely Lynch's addition to the text. It's not written in the stage direction. It comes from an actor who understood that a mentor without warmth isn't a mentor. She's just a superior officer. The braiding scene, as discussed throughout this essay, is Lynch's greatest moment. But what makes it great isn't just what she says, it's what she chooses to share and what she chooses not to. Izogie talks about the man she still thinks about with a lightness that is clearly practiced. She has told this story before, or versions of it, to herself in quiet moments until she found a way to tell it without being undone by it. Lynch plays the practice quality of that lightness with complete transparency. You see both the ease and the effort simultaneously, which is the precise emotional texture of someone who has done the work of making peace with a difficult truth without fully arriving at peace. Her death, as noted in the Act 3 discussion, lands with the force it does entirely because of what Lynch built before it. But there's something else worth noting about Lynch's final appearance in the film. She plays Izogie's last moments without visible fear. There is no, "Please, don't do this" energy. There is no desperate fight for survival that the enemy overwhelms. What the film shows us, briefly, at a distance, without extended focus, is someone who knows what is happening and faces it with the specific, hard-earned composure of a woman who decided when she joined the Agojie what she was willing to die for. It's a choice consistent with everything Lynch built across the film. And it makes Izogie's death, in retrospect, not only a tragedy, but a completion. The most complete version of herself, expressing itself in the final moment available to express it. The character of King Ghezo is the film's most dangerous dramatic element because he is the most easily misread. He could be read as a villain, a king who perpetuates the slave trade, who tells his general she's wrong about the moral direction of the kingdom, who exercises authority over women's choices and lives. He could be read as a hero, a king who listens to Nanisca, who ultimately elevates her, who is shown to genuinely care about the future of his people. John Boyega plays him as neither, and that refusal is the most sophisticated dramatic choice in the film. Ghezo is a pragmatist. He is a man who inherited a kingdom in crisis and has kept it alive through a series of compromises that he knows, with some part of himself, are slowly corrupting it. Boyega plays this self-knowledge at a very specific register, not guilt exactly, and not rationalization, but something in between that resembles the way intelligent people acknowledge uncomfortable truths while continuing to act against them. Because the alternative to the compromise, in Ghezo's calculation, is worse. More people would suffer. The kingdom would fall. And the kingdom falling is not an abstraction for him. It's the end of everything he is responsible for protecting. The scene where he receives Nanisca's argument about the slave trade is the key to Boyega's entire performance. He doesn't dismiss her. He doesn't become defensive or political. He listens, genuinely, carefully, with the full attention of someone who takes her seriously. And then he says no. And the particular quality of that no, reasonable, sorrowful, final, tells you everything about the specific tragedy of Ghezo's character. He sees what Nanisca sees. He agrees with what she's arguing, somewhere deep and private. He cannot yet be the king that the argument requires. Boyega's physical authority in this role is worth noting separately. He doesn't play Ghezo as physically imposing in the way that a war film king is usually coded. He's warm, even playful at times. He has a quality of ease with his own power that reads as someone who grew up around authority rather than someone who seized it. That ease makes him more interesting as a character because it means his failures aren't rooted in insecurity or cruelty. They're rooted in something more common and more corrosive. The willingness of a basically decent person to keep doing the wrong thing because the right thing is inconvenient. He plays it with a complexity that earns its own kind of admiration. This is a king, acknowledging that the person in front of him has a better moral compass than he does, and choosing to formalize that acknowledgement even though it diminishes, in some sense, his own standing. There's something that functions like pride in his expression, something that functions like relief. And underneath both of those, very quietly, the weight of everything the title represents, both the recognition and the implicit admission of his own insufficient choosing. Boyega is enormously skilled, and this role gives him more to do, psychologically, than almost anything he's been offered in his Hollywood career. He doesn't waste it. Sheila Atim's Amenza doesn't get the screen time that the other four central characters receive, and that's by design. But the design would fail completely without Atim's extraordinary precision in every moment she's given. Amenza is Nanisca's oldest companion, her witness, her spiritual counterweight. Where Nanisca is steel, Amenza is something more supple, not soft, but permeable. She sees things. She holds space. She is the person in Nanisca's life who knows the full history and stays anyway, which is its own kind of love. Autumn, a Tony Award-winning stage actress who brings a theatrical spaciousness to her screen work, communicates Amenza's decades of friendship with Nanisca through the specific quality of her attention. When she looks at Nanisca, she doesn't look the way a subordinate looks at a superior, or the way a friend looks at someone they're concerned about. She looks the way someone looks at a person they have known long enough to see beneath every layer, with a quality of recognition that goes past the surface into the actual person underneath. Her best moment is also her quietest. After Nanisca's confession about Nawi, After the disclosure of the trauma and the child and the shark tooth, Amenza doesn't respond with comfort or words. She sits with Nanisca in the silence, and what Atim does with her body in that silence communicates an entire grammar of solidarity. The sitting is the response. The staying is the response. She's telling Nanisca, without a syllable, that she already knew or suspected, and that her knowing changed nothing about how she sees her. That's the kind of screen performance that only an actor who understands silence as an instrument can deliver. Atim understands it at concert level. Together, these 5 performances constitute something rare in contemporary Hollywood, an ensemble where every character, including the ones who don't survive, including the ones who make the morally complicated choices, including the ones who appear only briefly, feels completely, irrevocably real. They're not there to serve the plot. The plot is there to reveal what they are. And what they are is extraordinary. The people who brought them to life on screen made sure of that, but so did the people behind the camera. And that's exactly where we need to go next. Here's a question that doesn't get asked often enough about this film. What would The Woman King look like if it had been made by a different cinematographer, a different composer, a different choreographer? The answer is significantly less. Possibly not good at all, because what Gina Prince Bythewood assembled behind the camera for this production wasn't just a technically proficient crew. She assembled a group of artists who each brought a specific philosophical commitment to the project, a shared understanding that telling this story right required making choices that Hollywood's default visual and sonic language was not equipped to make. Every key decision about how this film looks, sounds, and moves is a deliberate departure from convention. And understanding those departures, understanding what they replace, and why the replacement matters, is essential to understanding why The Woman King lands the way it does. Let's start with the image. Polly Morgan, BSc, ASC, became the first woman to serve as director of photography on a major Hollywood studio action film when she shot The Woman King. That's a historical fact, and it's worth sitting with, not because it should be remarkable that a woman could do this job at the highest level, but because it tells you something about how long Hollywood has been answering the wrong question about who gets to define what a film looks like. Morgan had established herself through her work on A Quiet Place Part 2 and various television productions, but The Woman King represented a scale and a mandate she hadn't encountered before. And the visual language she developed for Dahomey is simply one of the most purposeful and beautiful bodies of cinematographic work in recent American cinema. Start with color. Hollywood has a persistent habit, when shooting stories set in Africa or the global south, of reaching for desaturation. Cool, slightly bleached palettes that code authenticity or grit or reality to a Western audience trained by decades of documentary and prestige film conventions. Think of the aesthetic you've seen in countless films set in sub-Saharan Africa, the blown-out skies, the dusty tones, the visual suggestion of a world that is somehow less vivid than the world of a European or American story. Morgan rejects this entirely. The kingdom of Dahomey in The Woman King is saturated, deeply, richly, specifically saturated with colors that feel earned rather than processed. The ochres and deep greens of the Dahomeyan landscape aren't a stylistic choice in the decorative sense. They're an act of respect. They're saying, this world is as vivid as any world ever put on film. These people live in a kingdom of color and texture and material richness, and your camera is going to honor that rather than drain it. The specific palette Morgan develops, warm golds, terracottas, the deep blue greens of the Dahomeyan forest, the burnt orange of firelight against stone, is also historically informed. The production design team under Aiken McKenzie worked closely with Morgan on ensuring that the colors of the built environments and the natural locations were in conversation with each other. What results is a visual world that feels cohesive without feeling artificial, a kingdom that appears to have been photographed as it actually was, rather than color-graded into a mood. Then there's the question of how Morgan lights skin. And this requires some directness, because it's one of the most important things happening in this film visually, and it deserves to be said plainly. Hollywood has a long, documented history of underexposing dark skin tones. For decades, the standard exposure tools, from the Kodak Shirley cards used to calibrate film stock to the default lighting ratios taught in cinematography programs, were built around lighter skin as the reference point. Dark skin was consistently underlit, underexposed, pushed into shadow in ways that ranged from thoughtless to actively dehumanizing. This is not ancient history. It is a pattern visible across films from the 1920s through well into the 2000s, and its effects are still being corrected. Morgan lights black skin the way it deserves to be lit, which is to say, as the primary subject of every frame, deserving of whatever light is required to make every detail visible and every emotion readable. In The Woman King, no actor's face is lost in shadow that wasn't deliberately chosen. No expression is swallowed by underexposure. And crucially, Morgan finds light sources within the world of the film. The West African sun, firelight, the glow of torches, the diffused light of the training ground, and uses them to sculpt faces with a warmth that feels simultaneously natural and deeply intentional. The golden hour sequences are the clearest expression of this philosophy. When the Agojie are shown in training during the late afternoon, the light falls on Viola Davis and Thuso Mbedu and Lashana Lynch in a way that is, without exaggeration, painterly. It recalls the kind of luminous portraiture that European masters applied to their subjects, the conviction that the human face, lit properly, is one of the most beautiful things a visual medium can record. The Agojie deserve that conviction. Morgan makes sure they receive it. Beyond color and exposure, Morgan's visual language operates through a precise tension between two modes, intimacy and scale. In the film's interior scenes, conversations, confessions, the quiet moments between characters that carry the weight of the story's emotional architecture, Morgan works handheld, close, at a focal length that puts you in the room with the person being photographed. The camera doesn't observe from a respectful distance, it participates. When Nanisca is delivering the shark tooth confession, the camera is close enough to catch the micro-movements of Davis's face, the ones we analyzed in the character segment, and its slight, barely perceptible movements echo the quality of a listener leaning in, trying to hear something that is being said very quietly and very carefully. This proximity is not accidental. It's an argument about who these women are. The default camera grammar of the war epic places its heroes at a slight remove, figures against landscapes, individuals within the sweep of history. Morgan insists on the opposite. These are people, close up, specific, particular. The landscape is their context, not their definition. But then the battle comes, and the grammar shifts. In the large-scale action sequences, Morgan pulls back to give you the geography, the spatial relationships that tell you who is where and what each position means tactically. She uses wider lenses, more stable platforms, longer takes that allow the choreography to breathe and be read rather than hidden by editing. The opening raid in the forest, shot partially with silhouettes against pre-dawn darkness, uses negative space the way great action filmmakers use it. Not to hide the action, but to shape its revelation. You see shapes, then shapes with purpose. Then, when the moment arrives, people, lit suddenly and specifically, doing something extraordinary. The contrast between these two modes, intimate handheld and expansive tactical wide, is the visual spine of the film. And the sophistication of Morgan's work is that the grammar shifts serve the story rather than the show reel. Close when character is the subject. Wide when geography is the subject. Always in service of making sure the audience knows exactly where they are, emotionally and spatially, at every moment. That sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the hardest things a cinematographer can do at the scale of a major studio action film. Terence Blanchard is one of the great film composers working today, a jazz trumpeter and band leader who has scored Spike Lee's films for decades and brings to every project an understanding of music as emotional intelligence rather than emotional instruction. His score for The Woman King is perhaps the most culturally specific and emotionally sophisticated work of his career, and it functions in the film not as background atmosphere, but as a living, breathing presence that the drama responds to. The foundation of the score is West African percussion, specifically the djembe, a goblet-shaped drum played with the hands, capable of a tonal range that moves from deep bass thump to sharp penetrating crack, and the talking drum, a waist drum whose pitch can be varied through arm pressure to approximate the tonal patterns of human speech. Blanchard builds the score around these instruments the way a jazz composer builds around a rhythm section, not as decoration over the main event, but as the rhythmic and melodic skeleton that everything else grows from. Why does this matter? Because it means the film's emotional vocabulary is rooted in the cultural context of the story it's telling. The music doesn't translate Dahomey into something Western audiences recognize by borrowing Hollywood's established epic score conventions, the swelling strings, the heroic brass, the percussion-driven battle music that Zimmer codified and everyone since has been borrowing. It builds a sonic language from inside the world of the film and invites the audience into that world rather than filtering the world through familiar musical shortcuts. The training sequences are the most explicit expression of this philosophy. When the Agojie train, when the recruits push through the gauntlet, when the sparring intensifies, when the collective physical effort of 30 women reaches its apex, Blanchard scores it, not with Western action music, but with layered djembe patterns that build on each other, each layer adding urgency and complexity until the percussion fills the space completely. What this achieves is something remarkable. The music makes the Agojie's training feel like it belongs to a specific cultural tradition. Their effort isn't heroic in the generic Hollywood sense. It's heroic in the Dahomeyan sense, rooted in this place, this history, these specific women and the ancestors who trained before them. The contrast between the scored and unscored sequences is equally purposeful. Blanchard and Prince Bythewood made deliberate choices about where the music stops, and those moments of silence are as compositional as any note. The scene where Nanisca discloses her trauma has almost no score underneath it. The absence of music is not an oversight, it's an argument. This is too private, too specific, too raw for the generalization that music imposes on emotion. The scene has to breathe in the air of the real, and music would aestheticize it in a way that would create distance from the very thing the film is trying to close distance toward. Similarly, Izogie's death is stripped of scoring at its most critical moment. When you're watching a scene with music, part of your brain is receiving instruction about how to feel. Remove the music, and you are fully in the unmediated experience of the image. The film trusts, in those moments, that what it has built, the characters, the relationships, the specific human weight of what is happening, is enough. More than enough. And it is. The orchestral elements of the score arrive most fully in the film's final sequences, the coronation, the aftermath. And what Blanchard does there is bring together the West African percussion foundation and the orchestral swell in a combination that feels earned rather than imposed. The strings don't overwhelm the drums don't resist the strings. They coexist, the way Dahomey itself exists, at the intersection of African tradition and an encroaching outside world, holding on to both, navigating the space between them, refusing to let either completely subsume the other. It's a score that thinks. In a genre where scores are frequently just loud, that's rarer than it should be. Before a single frame of The Woman King was shot, fight choreographer Ramona Ramirez faced a genuinely unprecedented creative problem: design a fighting system for a group of women warriors from 1823 West Africa, of whom no video documentation exists, whose specific combat methods aren't preserved in any accessible historical record, and whose style of fighting needs to be simultaneously historically plausible, visually distinctive, and executable at speed by actors who are not lifelong martial artists. In other words, invent something from nothing, but make it feel like it was always there. Ramirez and Prince Bythewood approached this problem through research rather than invention. They studied what was known about the Agojie's weapon, the machete-like cutlass, the musket, the club, the bow, and the physical demands of the terrain they fought on. They studied West African dance traditions, which often contain the muscle memory and movement vocabulary of warrior cultures even when those cultures are no longer actively fighting. They consulted historians and cultural advisors, and they built a physical language for the Agojie that is rooted in this research, angular, close-range, economical, designed to neutralize rather than spectacularize. What sets the Agojie's fighting style apart from conventional Hollywood action choreography is its refusal of individual heroics. Hollywood's default action vocabulary celebrates the singular virtuoso, the one fighter who moves through a crowd of enemies like water, effortless and untouchable. The Agojie fight as a unit. They create angles of attack together, cover each other's vulnerabilities, move in patterns that multiply their effectiveness. This is tactically accurate to how small military units actually fight. It's also, visually, completely different from what audiences expect, and that difference is precisely the point. The training montages in the film show you the building blocks of this vocabulary. The sparring isn't just physical conditioning, it's the process of two bodies learning to read each other, to anticipate each other's movement, to build the kind of reflexive coordination that can only come from shared physical practice over time. By the final battle, when you see the Agojie in combat, you understand the relationship between what they trained and what they're doing. The battles feel like proof of the training, which is both satisfying narratively and more honest about how warfare actually functions than the typical action film's approach of training, as montage and fighting, as magic. Production designer Aiken Mackenzie built the Kingdom of Dahomey from the ground up in South Africa, primarily in KwaZulu-Natal, whose landscapes provided the coastal West African terrain the story required. Mackenzie's approach was to make every environment feel inhabited, lived in, worn, carrying the specific textures of a culture that has been here for a long time and knows it. The Agojie compound is the film's most important built environment, and Mackenzie designed it as a space that functions on multiple registers simultaneously. It's a military installation, ordered, purposeful, structured around training and readiness. But it's also, unmistakably, a home. The sleeping quarters have the warmth of spaces where people sleep and talk and braid each other's hair. The communal areas carry the accumulated presence of women who have lived their lives here, made their choices here, built their identities here. Mackenzie gives the compound a patina, a layered sense of time and habitation that you can't manufacture with new construction. It required both the design intelligence to specify and the practical execution to build something that looked like it had been standing for decades. The palace of King Ghezo operates on a different visual register, more formal, more ornate, carrying the weight of political authority through architecture. The geometry is different, more vertical, more imposing, designed to make the individual feel small against the institution. When Nanisca stands in front of Ghezo's court, making her argument about the slave trade, the spatial relationship between the two characters, the general in the open floor, the king elevated on his throne, is a built argument about power, one that Mackenzie's design makes without any dialogue. Costume designer Gersha Phillips approached the Agojie's visual identity with the same specificity that characterized the rest of the production. The Agojie's garments went through extensive research and iteration. The draped fabric, the hand-tooled leather armor, the specific way women of Dahomey dressed in the early 19th century, both for daily life and for combat. Many pieces were handmade specifically for the production, drawing on actual Dahomeyan textile traditions for their patterns and construction. But Phillips's most intelligent design decision isn't in the Agojie's warrior gear. It's in Nawi's costume arc. Watch what Nawi is wearing in every scene of the film, and you'll see a meticulous visual record of her transformation. She arrives in the compound in clothes that are domestic, soft, belonging to the civilian world she came from. Through the training sequences, her clothing becomes progressively more functional, less decorative, more purposeful. By the time she's in full combat gear for the final battle, the costume is doing exactly what the performance is doing, presenting someone who has shed the identity her origin assigned her and built a new one from the ground up. That's costume as character arc. And it works because Phillips designed it to work, because the transformation is specific and incremental rather than a single before and after swap. What unites all three of these craft elements, the cinematography, the score, the choreography, and design, is a shared philosophical commitment that traces directly back to Gina Prince Bythewood's central mandate for the production. The directive wasn't make this look and sound like a good Hollywood epic. The directive was make this look and sound like this specific world and let that world's specificity speak for itself. It requires Polly Morgan to invent a lighting grammar for West African skin rather than defaulting to what cinematography schools taught. It requires Terence Blanchard to build a score from West African percussion upward rather than mapping a Western orchestral template onto an African story. It requires Ramona Ramirez to invent a fighting system rather than adapt one. It requires Gersha Phillips and Aiken Mackenzie to earn their historical details rather than approximate them. The fact that all of them met that directive on the same production at the same level of commitment is what makes The Woman King look and sound unlike anything you've seen before. Not because it's technically revolutionary in a formal sense, but because every technical decision is in service of the same thing, giving this specific story, these specific women, this specific kingdom, the full, particular, unreduced visual and sonic world they deserve. That world doesn't just look beautiful. It argues something. It insists that these lives were vivid, that this history was real. That beauty in cinema is not a neutral choice. It is always a statement about who and what is worth your full, unhurried attention. The Woman King has decided what it thinks about that question, and it answers with every frame. A film can be technically magnificent and emotionally powerful and still be, at the level of ideas, safe. It can show you extraordinary people doing extraordinary things and leave you, at the end, with nothing to wrestle with. No question you can't answer. No discomfort that outlasts the credits. Just the clean, satisfying feeling of having witnessed something good. The Woman King is not that film. Underneath the battle sequences and the performances and the luminous cinematography, this is a story built on a series of genuinely hard questions that it poses without resolving. Questions about who gets to exercise power and what it costs. Questions about complicity, how deeply a good person can be embedded in a corrupt system before their goodness starts to run out. Questions about whether survival and morality can coexist without one slowly consuming the other. These aren't decorative themes dropped into the narrative to give the film intellectual credibility. They're structural, embedded in the bones of every relationship and every choice in the story. And they're the reason. The Woman King is still worth arguing about years after its release. Let's take them seriously. The Agojie are the film's central paradox, and understanding that paradox is essential to understanding what the film is actually saying about women and power. Here's the paradox. The Agojie are the most powerful women in their world. They are warriors, generals, enforcers of the kingdom's will. They answer directly to the king. Enemy soldiers fear them. Their training is more demanding than almost anything any person in this story endures. By every metric of worldly power, physical capability, institutional authority, social respect, the Agojie sit near the top of Dahomeyan society. And they serve a king. They are his force, his instrument, his army. Their autonomy exists entirely within a structure that is ultimately patriarchal. A king who is a man, a court that is dominated by men, a political economy that, for most of the film, depends on the capture and sale of human beings who are largely women and children. The Agojie's power is real. It is also bounded. What does the film do with that paradox? The easy choice would be to ignore it, to let the Agojie's power read as simply liberatory, uncomplicated, a fantasy of female strength without friction. Prince Bythewood doesn't make the easy choice. The film holds the paradox deliberately, and what it finds inside it is something more interesting than either pure liberation or pure constraint. The Agojie's power is real because it exists inside the structure, not despite it. Ghezo's court legitimizes the Agojie. The kingdom's needs require them. And in return, the institution of the Agojie creates a space, specific, bounded, earned through extraordinary sacrifice, where women exercise authority that the rest of 1823 West Africa would never grant them. It's not freedom. But it's not nothing. It's a negotiated space, carved out through centuries of women insisting on their own capacity and a political structure deciding their capacity was useful. Nawi's arrival makes this tension visible. She comes to the compound not through political design but through personal refusal. She said no to a man who hit her, and the entire domestic structure of her family collapsed around that no. The Agojie absorbs her refusal and gives it somewhere to go. Her ungovernable quality, the thing that made her impossible in her father's house, becomes, in the Agojie's training ground, a resource. The institution doesn't change her. It finds a use for what she already is. But the cost is specific and non-negotiable. To join the Agojie is to give up marriage, children, and the domestic future that is the only alternative path available to women in this world. The film doesn't pretend its cost is small. The braiding scene, Izogie talking about the man she still thinks about, names it directly. The choice to become this required, not choosing something else, and not choosing something else had weight that doesn't go away just because the alternative was worth it. What Nanisca's arc adds to this thematic layer is the question of what happens when the cost is not freely chosen but violently imposed. Nanisca didn't give up motherhood as a deliberate exercise of her Agojie identity. It was taken from her, by assault, and then the choice she made about the child, the shark tooth, the giving up, was made under conditions of trauma and danger that remove the possibility of any truly free decision. Her journey through the film is partly about reclaiming authorship over a choice that was never really hers, not undoing it, not resolving it into something comfortable, but finding a way to own it, to say, I did this, in these conditions, and I am still the person who did it, and that person deserves to keep standing. That distinction between freely chosen sacrifice and violently imposed loss is one the film handles with remarkable precision. It refuses to collapse them together into a single story about women who give things up. It insists on the specific difference between choosing and being robbed, and on the different kinds of reckoning each demands. Let's address this directly because it was the most contested element of the Woman King's reception, and the conversation around it was frequently less precise than the film itself deserved. The criticism, stated plainly, was this: Dahomey was a significant participant in the Atlantic slave trade, selling captives from neighboring peoples to European traders at Ouida. The Woman King, the argument went, softens this history, makes the Agojie legible as heroes by positioning them as opponents of the slave trade, when the historical reality was considerably more complicated, and the Agojie themselves participated in the capture of people who were sold into slavery. This is a legitimate historical conversation. The underlying facts are real, documented, and important. Dahomey's role in the Atlantic slave trade was substantial and caused genuine, catastrophic suffering to a very large number of human beings. Here is what the film actually does with this history, as opposed to what its critics claimed it does. It names Dahomey's participation in the slave trade explicitly. It shows the trading infrastructure, Ferreira and the Portuguese, the economic dependency, the specific compromise Ghezo is making and defending. It shows Nanisca arguing forcefully and persistently that this is wrong and must stop. And it shows Ghezo resisting that argument, not because he's villainous, but because the economy of his kingdom is genuinely dependent on it, and he genuinely doesn't know another way. What the film doesn't do is resolve that tension. Nanisca doesn't win the argument. Ghezo doesn't have a conversion moment where he suddenly sees the moral light. By the film's end, the slave trade is still operational. The economic structure that enables it is still in place. The film's heroism, Nanisca freeing the captives, defying Ghezo's orders, is an act of individual moral clarity inside a system that the individual moral clarity does not dismantle. That is a more honest representation of how human beings navigate complicit systems than the version critics implied the film was peddling. It doesn't say these women were untouched by the corruption of their kingdom. It says these women were both embedded in that corruption and fighting against it simultaneously, with different degrees of success in different arenas. And that simultaneous embeddedness and resistance is what actually looks like when human beings try to act with integrity inside structures that make integrity incomplete. Is the film a perfect historical document? No. It's a Hollywood drama, and it makes choices that serve narrative coherence and audience accessibility. But the criticism that it sanitizes the slave trade requires ignoring several explicit scenes that do the opposite. The more precise critique, that it doesn't fully examine the scale of Dahomey's participation, is fair, and the film would have been richer for doing more. But doesn't do enough, and actively deceives, are different charges, and much of the reception discourse conflated them. What the film gets right, thematically, is the moral atmosphere of complicity. It makes the slave trade not a clean villain external to the story's heroes, but a structural condition that the heroes live inside, benefit from in some ways, and fight against in others. That's uncomfortable. Good. It should be. The film's most intimate theme is also its most precisely calibrated. Nanisca's relationship to Nawi isn't a story about a mother who was separated from her child and wants her back. It's a story about a woman who made an impossible choice under impossible conditions and has spent decades refusing to examine it, because examining it would require acknowledging a level of pain that her survival, the survival of the general, the leader, the armor, couldn't accommodate. The shark tooth is the film's central symbol, and what makes it work is that it functions simultaneously as wound and love letter. Nanisca cut her own child to mark her, an act of violence in the service of connection, an injury inflicted to enable future recognition. There is no clean way to read that act. It is both a form of abandonment and a form of devotion, both a scar and a signature. The film doesn't try to resolve the contradiction. It lets both readings be true simultaneously, because both readings are true. What the film's ending does with this, the quiet acknowledgement between Nanisca and Nawi, the restrained non-reunion, is argue something specific about healing, that it isn't a dramatic event. It doesn't arrive in a single scene. It begins, tentatively, in the moment when two people decide to be honest about what exists between them rather than what they wish existed or what the official story would prefer to exist. The nod, the recognition, the beginning of something that will have to be built slowly, imperfectly, with the full weight of what happened between them present in every conversation. That honesty about the non-linearity of healing is rarer in mainstream cinema than it should be. Films want cathartic reunions. They want tearful acknowledgments and immediate closeness. The Woman King wants something truer and less comfortable, the opening of a door, and the understanding that what's on the other side of that door will take years to navigate. The final theme is the one most visible on the film's surface, and it's worth examining carefully precisely because it seems obvious. The Agojie are a community of women who support each other, yes, and the film celebrates that community. But the specific quality of the sisterhood this film depicts is more complex than simple solidarity, and it's worth naming what makes it distinct. The Agojie's community isn't built on shared origin or shared ideology. It isn't a sisterhood of women who already agree with each other, who come from the same place, who have the same relationship to the institution they've joined. Nawi is a late arrival from a domestic life. Izogie is a veteran who has made peace with the costs of her choices. Nanisca is the commanding officer who has made herself into something closer to a weapon than a person. Amenza is the spiritual anchor who holds space for everyone else's unraveling. These women are not naturally similar. The sisterhood between them is actively constructed, built through shared physical suffering, shared purpose, shared choice. This matters because it's honest about how communities of women actually form, as opposed to how they're frequently romanticized. The Agojie don't love each other because they're women together. They love each other because they chose this life together, because they pushed through the same thorned walls and sparred in the same dust and braided each other's hair at the end of days that would have broken people with less to hold on to. And they protect each other with a specificity that transcends institutional loyalty. When Nanisca defies Ghezo to free the captives, she's not acting on political conviction alone. She's acting on the knowledge, lived and specific, of what it means to be a woman held by men who see you as property. The protection the Agojie extends is personal. It comes from a particular place. It says, we know what this costs, because some of us have paid it, and we will not let it be paid again if we can prevent it. That's the kind of solidarity that doesn't need a slogan. It just needs women who remember what it felt like to be vulnerable and who decided, consciously, permanently, to make their strength available to people who haven't yet found their own. The Agojie didn't abolish the slave trade. They didn't dismantle the patriarchy of their kingdom. They didn't resolve the political crises bearing down on Dahomey from every direction. What they did, what the film argues they did, and what Nanisca embodies as its culminating statement, was hold a space, a specific, hard-won, imperfect, genuinely extraordinary space where women could become the full, fierce, complicated, capable people they already were. In 1823 West Africa, in 2022 Hollywood, in any year and any context where that kind of space has to be fought for, which has been and remains almost every year and almost every context there is. It's not a comfortable argument, it's not a simple one, and it is, without question, the right one. When The Woman King premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2022, the audience stood up, not politely, not briefly, a sustained, full-throated standing ovation for a film about women that most of Hollywood had spent years quietly doubting would find an audience large enough to justify its budget. The numbers, when they came in, said something definitive, roughly $98 million worldwide on a $50 million investment. A 94% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes paired with a 99% audience score, one of the widest gaps between critical enthusiasm and popular response in recent memory, and in this case the gap ran toward love rather than away from it. On its opening weekend, The Woman King outperformed industry projections significantly, drawing an audience that was notably diverse in age, race, and gender, the kind of audience that studios claim they want to reach and then perpetually fail to make films for. The commercial success mattered, not because money is the appropriate measure of a film's worth, but because in the specific context of Hollywood's long resistance to funding large-scale stories centered on black women, the box office receipts functioned as a rebuttal. Every studio executive who had looked at a pitch for a film like this and asked, "But who's the audience?" received a very clear, very loud, very expensive answer. But the cultural impact of The Woman King runs deeper than a single weekend's grosses. Think about what Gina Prince Bythewood actually accomplished here. Not in the abstract language of representation, but in the specific, practical terms of what gets made next. She directed a 2-hour historical action epic, delivered it on budget, and proved that the directing talent, the producing infrastructure, and the audience appetite for this kind of story had always existed. The gap wasn't capability. The gap was opportunity. And once that gap closed, even briefly, it became impossible to credibly argue it couldn't close again. For black women watching The Woman King in theaters, watching Viola Davis command a frame with the full resources of a major studio production behind her, watching Thuso Mbedu carry an emotional arc of that complexity and that length, watching Lashana Lynch be given enough screen time and enough character depth to become someone irreplaceable. The experience wasn't just entertainment. It was a specific kind of recognition, the recognition of seeing the full scope of your own humanity reflected back at you from a screen that has spent most of its history offering you fragments at best. That recognition doesn't expire, it accumulates. Then there's what The Woman King did for the actual history it drew from. The Agojie were real. Most people outside of West African historical scholarship didn't know that before September 22. After the film's release, interest in the Dahomey Amazons, the Western label that the film itself is careful to use sparingly, spiked globally. Museums and academic institutions reported increased queries about Dahomeyan history. Smithsonian Magazine ran features on the real warriors behind the film. Historians who had spent careers writing about West African military history found suddenly, briefly, that the world was interested in what they knew. This is one of the things popular cinema can do that almost no other medium matches. It can make an enormous number of people simultaneously curious about something they had never thought to be curious about before. Whatever the film's historical simplifications, whatever the legitimate criticisms of its relationship to the full complexity of Dahomey's history, it sent millions of people toward that history who wouldn't otherwise have looked. That's not nothing. In a world where the standard of mainstream historical knowledge about West Africa remains embarrassingly low, that's actually quite a lot. The conversation the film sparked, about whose stories deserve epic treatment, about how Hollywood tells African history, about the moral complexity of heroism within complicit systems, that conversation didn't close when the theatrical run ended. It continued in classrooms, in film criticism, in the ongoing reckoning with how black history is represented on screen and who gets to shape that representation. The Woman King contributed something durable to that reckoning, a data point, a precedent, an argument made not in theory but in practice. You can make a film like this. People will come. The story will matter. Somewhere in the archive of human history, there are women who trained every morning before dawn, who ran into thorned walls without flinching, who chose a life that cost them everything domestic and gave them something that had no civilian name yet. They didn't leave a lot of record. They left accounts written by outsiders who were usually astonished, occasionally contemptuous, and almost always working from within a framework that had no adequate category for what they were seeing. They deserve better than that framework. They deserve the full frame, the right light, the score that grew from the same earth they trained on. 200 years after the kingdom of Dahomey was fighting to survive on the West African coast, a filmmaker and a cast and a crew decided to give it to them. The women in the dark, at the edge of the forest, waiting. They've been waiting long enough.